Okay, great. I will try to be fast. Sorry for that already. So I'm going to present our work, which we did on event reconstruction from network traffic. So first of all, who am I? I'm Jan. I'm a researcher at the Fraunhofer Institute back in Germany. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Bonn, and I'm a regular attendee of DFRWS since EU 2017. Now, my PhD is basically focused on file system forensics and file system analysis. Itself is very exciting. We all know why it is exciting. And Brian Carrier already wrote a book about this roughly 20 years ago. It's this very, very thick book. If you haven't read it, I can highly recommend it. And the problem with this book is that it's like from 20 years ago. So the PhD topic which I have is called Contemporary File System Forensic Analysis, which takes a look at file systems which are used nowadays and how to deal with them during investigations. So I probably am the only one, but I put my research questions here. The first question is actually what kind of concepts of contemporary file systems, the file systems we use nowadays, are not covered in this book. And there has been a lot of development since 2005. The second question then is, can we use the model and workflow Brian Carrier has presented also with these file systems we see nowadays? Second thing is, plot twist, it cannot always. So how can we modify his model so that it can be used for these contemporary file systems? And the last question is, are there any specific new features or characteristics of these file systems which may require new thought during an analysis, but also could enrich and add value to an analysis? The PhD is based on 4 publications. As you can see, there were 2 in the US in 2017 and 2018, which were focused on ZFS and BetterFS as file systems, which were not covered by Brian Carrier. Then there was a very, very long gap, and then I thought I want to continue the PhD. So there was a paper last year at EU and at APEC. Today we're going to talk about the paper which was presented at APEC and then extended in the paper which is here at DFDS. And it was about files which were transferred over a network. And there may be various reasons why files are transferred over a network. One example is shown here. It's a distributed file system stored on multiple servers. And if you want to access it as a client, there sometimes has to be a connection to all of these servers. But of course, there are easier examples if a file system is just stored on a server and you remotely access it, for example, using the server message block protocol by Microsoft. And the question we had is, can this network traffic, which definitely has some file system related data in it, somehow enhance the traditional file system forensics? One thing we looked at in this paper was, how can we reconstruct the original file system, like get old file versions and stuff like that? And we also looked at how can we reconstruct specific user interactions, because it's not just a transfer of files. There has to be a reason why a file was transferred, like somebody accessed it, somebody wrote to it or whatever. And we were looking at how can we reconstruct these user interactions from network traffic. And this is also what we wanted to extend upon. The reconstruction of user interactions. So in our initial paper, we had like a very, very small proof of concept evaluation. We used the command line utility in Windows and performed roughly 20 commands on it on an SMB share over the network. And this results in a PCAP containing a lot of packets, SMB packets in this case. And now if you perform network forensics, you have this network capture. And the question is, how can we go back from these packets, which we have, back to the actual commands that were executed. Not only like these are the files which are inside the PCAP, which is what Wireshark, for example, gives you, but to actually the commands and events that the user performed, like the interactions. And for this, we introduced so-called SMB command fingerprinting. I'm going to talk about what that is in a minute. That's it. And the paper we put here actually it takes this SMB command fingerprinting approach and improves it, because we have shown that it works well on these 20 commands, but this is not very robust testing of this approach. So in this work, we first of all extended the algorithm we proposed. Afterwards, we created new rules for other applications and not just the command line utility. And afterwards, we performed an evaluation which had a few thousand commands which we wanted to reconstruct and not only 20. and also performed this for a single application as well as cross application. I'm also going to tell you what this is in roughly 4 minutes. Okay, so the idea behind SMB command fingerprinting is quite simple. If you perform an API call on Windows, the API call is performed on an SMB share, then you end up with some SMB commands which are shown in the lower part here. So if you perform the set file attributes API call on a file on an SMB share, you get a create, query info, set info, and close command in the network traffic itself. So the first thing we said is, how does it look with other API calls? If I do the get file attributes, I only get create and close. So the command sequence we actually get differs depending on the API call that we perform. This is the first thing we have to memorize. The second thing is, there are some API calls like delete file which have the same sequence. So we cannot use the sequence to say, okay, this person performed this API call because they are the same. But if we take a closer look into these SMB commands, we can see that the attributes differ at some parts. So for example, the set information is file basic info on the left side, but for delete file, there's file disposition info which is set. So these two things, taking a look at the sequence itself, plus the attributes which are inside a specific command itself, can be used to infer the actual API call or the actual event and interaction that was performed on the share. How can we facilitate the process of identifying this? Because looking manually through all the packets and identifying the sequence and stuff like that is painful. So we introduced SMB command fingerprinting, or SCF in short. It's similar to, for example, JA3 or 4, if you're familiar with that. It's an MD5 hash, which takes a few parameters into it, like, for example, a command type or some of these attributes, but of course not dynamic attributes like the path. So that for a single SMB command, like a create or a write or whatever, we can get a unique MD5 hash. And then we combine these MD5 hashes into a sequence so that we can also mirror the sequence of SMB commands and create a so-called SCF rule. And this rule then can be used to identify the sequence of SMB commands, including their internal attributes represented by this hash. That's the whole idea behind the algorithm or methodology we proposed. And it's used to then identify user interactions, as I said. Now, what we did in this paper for DFDS, we extended this proof of concept evaluation and also, first of all, extended the algorithm itself. We added some more flexibility so that some hashes can be skipped or are excluded in certain rules. We improved the matching logic, which was not as good as I hoped it would be, and stuff like this. So this was basically just how to improve the algorithm itself. Then we also used this extended algorithm and created new rule sets, which involved manually taking a look at, I perform this action using command line utility or PowerShell or SMB client for Linux, and taking a look at what kind of SMB packets with what kind of hashes are created, and then building our own manually crafted rule sets for these applications, which look like this. It's just like the example we've seen before, with a little bit more information. Then afterwards, we had to create a data set to evaluate. As I said, not with 20 operations performed, but a few thousands. For this, we created a framework, which is quite simple. We defined some file operations which are necessary, like reading a file, writing a file, creating directories, moving files, and stuff like that. And the framework itself had to be very scalable, so we could create a lot of operations, and we needed a ground truth which said this was the operation that was performed, and stuff like that. Afterwards, the data set was generated by following 5 phases, basically creating files on the share, then exploring them, modifying, like renaming, moving them, deleting, and then all of the commands we supported combined. We've done this for 3 applications, as I mentioned: command line utility, PowerShell on Windows, and SMB client on Linux. Whoops, and we are only going to look at one example because I'm running out of time. So this is the statistics about the data sets that we created. As you can see here, for command line, for the command line utility, there were roughly 12,700 operations that were performed, which eventually resulted in 320,000 only SMB packets. So if you imagine analyzing these packets by hand, or even if you use Wireshark, you basically only get the files which were transferred and no information about the actual user interactions which were there. This becomes quite painful and labor intensive. So yeah, the 12,700 operations are these, which you can see here. This is the part of our evaluation. And then we took a look at the matches we got for each of these operations. And in the brackets, you can see how many of these were actually correctly identified matches of the operation that was performed. As we can see here, in command line utility, we have two commands for renaming and moving directories and files. But apparently, the rules which we manually created already showed that these commands are resulting in the same SMB commands. So even though it's two different commands, it's for SMB, it's the same. So we did not distinguish between them. The other thing which I wanted to point out is the remove directory and remove file commands. For example, we only removed 575 files, but we had 1,800 matches for these files, or the same for the directories. We had more matches than actual file deletion operations or file or directory deletion operations, which was surprising, but the reason was pretty simple, because if you have a directory with subdirectories and sub-files in it, then SMB on Windows, or for the command line utility at least, creates a delete command for each of the sub-files and subdirectories in the directory. So it's not just one delete command which is sent over the network, it's a delete command for iteratively sent for all of them, which is quite interesting. So they're not really wrong, but not really what the user did at that point. We calculated the recall, which is simply the correctly reconstructed operations out of all of the performed operations. And as we can see here, using this approach, it was possible to reconstruct roughly 99.4% of operations. Okay. Now we also tried this on using, like, we had 3 rule sets for 3 applications. So we tried on the same data set with the 12,700 operations by command line utility. We also performed this evaluation. I know this table is, it looks painful. It took a lot of thinking, and this is unfortunately the best version Martin and I came up with. There are colors in it, which are explained in the paper. I only wanted to point out we have 2 recalls in this case. The app recall, which says we identified the correct event plus the correct application that caused it, the operation, the event. And we have an event recall, which is only the correct event, but the application doesn't matter in this case. Why is that important? Because we can see on the left side, the app recall is quite worse than the event recall, which is due to these 2 operations. And what this shows is that for the move and rename file and directory operations, we actually cannot really distinguish whether it was PowerShell or whether it was the command line utility. It works for all the other operations, but not for these 2. So we can still say it was a rename and move of a directory or file, but we cannot say if it was PowerShell or command line utility. Also, I wanted to point out these 5,000 false positives we had for PowerShell, which were basically due to a very, very short rule with only 1 command. And it was for a command which is used to like list the content of a directory. So maybe it's not that important to have this information, but bless you. But it was interesting to see that this can cause a lot of false positives. So maybe exclude this during the evaluation. Yeah, so yeah, there were only 73 which we could not reconstruct. And yeah, we had similar results for PowerShell, and for the SMB client, which was running on a different operating system, Linux, there was no interference at all with other rules. So that was possible to identify that it was SMB client running on Linux, including all of its commands. Yeah. Okay, conclusion and future work. That works. So using this evaluation, which had a lot of operations in it, the current state is we can say that it works well for identifying the event type. And even though there is some interference cross-application-wise, it works well for identifying most of the operations, or yeah, the majority of operations, plus telling which application performed it, even though there was some interference for PowerShell and command line utility, but they're, of course, closely related. What are we going to do in the future? We only looked at these 3 simple applications, but of course there's something like Windows Explorer, which may be used and causes network traffic, a lot of network traffic, which we're going to look at next and see if we can craft a rule set for this application and also look at encrypted SMB traffic. Then what would help me a lot is automated rule generation. How can we ease that process? And of course, SMB is not the only protocol that might be a candidate for using such a fingerprinting approach. There are protocols of distributed file systems or NFS and stuff like that, which could also be fingerprinted. Okay, what are the next steps for my PhD? I submitted actually a month ago, so this is gone. Thank you, thank you. And defense is going to be in June. Hey. Okay, and of course, we're going to perform more research on file system forensics, as I said, event reconstruction from network traffic, and how to actually enhance file system forensics with the features that contemporary file systems have at the moment. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.